Just a quick note, I suppose, but I think because of the character of the reading, and also, of course, like the circumstances in that, we're nearing the end of the semester, I think this might be probably the shortest video lecture of the semester. I don't know if that's something that you'll, to your credit, I think you would think that students will love that it's shorter, but actually no, I don't know that, maybe you'll want more content from your favorite content producer. But having said that, of course, we can have try and have a lively discussion on Moodle as best as possible. Okay, but so just some things I want to point out, and what I mean by the nature of it is that it's so much of it is talking about the film, which obviously that's one of those things where it's I'm not really going to add anything to I'm not going to really editorialize the reading of the film. I'm going to kind of leave that up to you, after you've seen the film, do you agree with his reading? And to think about how, other than what I've already pointed out, the manner in which he reads, it's not that far different from what we already do. It's very, very sophisticated, but it's almost there's not much more that I could do on top of that, right? Other than I can give my own reading, that sort of thing. But I do appreciate that from the very beginning that Rosenbaum begins with a historiographical bent, meaning that he's not just reproducing the idea of what a new wave is, and not simply saying there's an Iranian new wave, and this is, and Kiarostami is sort of at the forefront of it, but rather, he kind of situates what it means to have a new wave, right? And how it relates to Iran, right? To that, and this is the thing, right, is that these kind of movements of historiographizing, providing historiography, it's much less clumsy, and then also kind of asserting, for one, the plurality of a movement, right, that it's easy for us to kind of in hindsight say this is the Iranian new wave, but when you actually get into it, and especially during the period, there's, the consistency is just not, there, that it's contested, the boundaries are kind of loose, the actual participants might not all agree, that sort of thing. It's kind of easy for us to do that in hindsight, but I just want you to kind of think in terms of that wasn't always the case, right? And it's not even necessarily the case that will be the case for everyone, right? The same way that it's easy for you and I to say, oh, the high school history, the history we learned in high school, that's kind of standard, that's kind of convenient, it leaves out a lot of stuff, but that's not, don't take for granted that kind of thought is universal. There's a reason it's still taught that way. There's a reason that, certain people, a lot of people actually still believe that, history was X to Y to Z and it was great men and, blah, blah, blah. So even if something seems kind of old hat, don't ever assume that it's old hat for everyone, is I guess what I'm trying to get at. But two, right, what I do want to point out, right, is the demonization, right, of Iran and Iranian people that Rosenbaum kind of talks of, which I really appreciate that kind of discussion of, right, and how, just like with India or any other place, he's pointing out Iran is a country, right, and it's we are a country of 50 states, right, and places like California or Texas or Florida are so kind of vibrant and massive that we allow for them almost to have their own sort of unique identity, even within the country, like countries within a country. And yet we take other countries and almost treat them as if it's it's just one group of people and they're all the same, right? Whereas we have not only 50 places, states that are all unique, but even within the 50 states, we allow for even further kind of specificity. Do you see what I'm trying to get at? That, the same sort of kind of degree of particularity that we bring to bear to ourselves, we should be bringing to other places. This is one of the major lessons of studying Indian cinema, right? It's not just Bollywood, it's not just in Hindi. It doesn't work that way, right? I really appreciate, because again, this is stuff that's not, I don't think, nearly taught as much as it should, but the history of that kind of demonization with the Iranian hostage crisis during the Carter administration, on to page 3, which appears to have congealed most Western images of Iranians into a single one of fanatical fundamentalist terrorists, right? That, like, again, going back to like the idea of stereotypes or images, right? You picture, someone in the Rust Belt, right, or the Midwest, like even talking about as the Rust Belt. That's this. Texans are this. Floridians are this. Iranians are this, right? And unfortunately, again, talking about kind of post-colonialism and Fanon, these things can work in both directions. Even if it's a positive image, it's still kind of stabilizing or crystallizing an incredibly like diverse, heterogeneity into a singular image. It's still doing the same sort of thing. So that's not necessary. I mean, it's a little bit better, but it's still not great, right? Prior to this event, a CIA-orchestrated coup in 1953 ousted Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to install the friendly Shah and break the nationalist movement. And that's one of the things about like global history that we always sort of kind of conveniently gloss over, right? Is that we talk about these sort of enemy nations, that sort of thing, and we never talk about like our own role. Or some people do, but by and large we don't, right? Like, and we're rounding the corner. We're entering into Korean cinema next semester, or both next semester and next week. But similarly, like, why is there a North and a South? It's because of the Soviet Union and the U.S. It's not because of Korean self-autonomy and determination, right? Second main factor, end of the paragraph, is that practically no other contemporary image of Iran has been available in the West to counter or even complicate the fundamentalist stereotype, right? And then his suggestion, right, is that the new wave can be understood as a sort of, how do I put it, an effort or an attempt at self-representation, right? So you have negative stereotypes, and there just hasn't been enough to resist outright or even complicate, right? If you ask me personally, I am much more in the camp of complicating. I am not in the camp of replacing, right? Because we're still, and what I mean by that is that, like, to offer a counter stereotype, right? You're still offering a stereotype. But if you complicate the stereotype, for example, by like kind of diluting the pool, so if there's only an image of, let's say, the fundamentalist Iranian, but then you like flood the pool with all kinds of images, then it just gets us to think about like the very workings of stereotype to begin with. And that, again, is the critical thinking shift, right? So move one, this is the dialectic. Move one, you have the stereotype. Move two, you have the counter to the stereotype. But move three is to just make all sorts of more. And then it's like, well, are either of those right? See what I'm saying? That's what the critical thinker does. Is not simply say yes, no, but either, neither, both. That's the critical move. That is the dialectic. I know you've heard me say that before, and we can talk about it further, even though we're at the end of the semester. But these videos will be here forever unless I get embarrassed and delete them all, which probably won't happen because I don't care enough. I care enough about you, but not the videos. I do want to point out, in this discussion with The House is Black, there's a really, I find this introduction very curious, where this is, okay, this is Rosenbaum's, another note about Rosenbaum. This is Rosenbaum's book titled Abbas Kiarostami, about Abbas Kiarostami, but it was printed by the University of Illinois Press in 2003. So this is an academic press printing a book by a major film scholar, or a critic, right? So it's kind of curious, and part of that is because, Illinois, the state of Illinois and Chicago and Urbana-Champaign, there's a real kind of like vivid film criticism, kind of community and culture that can't be sort of, it's like sort of really joined with the academic side of things as well. But it is really curious, right, that on a book about Kiarostami, the introduction talks about so much about Farrokhzad, right? And that's something that I just want to point out, and then I want to get you to think about, and then maybe respond to on Moodle. You don't have to, but it is something I'm sure that some of you, if not all of you, kind of found that curious too. As with any sort of movement or group, right? This is obviously the new wave. Rosenbaum kind of approaches it as a community, right? Or he situates them. He points out that they were a community, right? That this was like a circle of people that all kind of work with one another. We saw this with like the fifth generation French New Wave as well, right? These people work with one another. They're in dialogue with one another. I can't think of Korean cinema will be the same. Very rarely can I think of like where it's like you have a movement of let's say filmmakers or artists or producers, and it's like they're not talking and they're just like working from like very separate locations, and then they all kind of congeal. It doesn't really happen that way usually, right? This is on 8, and then on 11, right? Rosenbaum kind of talks about what sort of connects them stylistically, right? What makes them quote-unquote kindred filmmakers, and it's the use of long shots, right? Long takes, and long shots, right? And we see this with like the Taiwanese filmmakers, European art cinema, but there is a way in which like long takes or slow cinema is often kind of automatically associated with art cinema, right? Something to think about. Art and art house cinema, which were not the same thing, necessarily the same thing. And in that sense, right, this is why Michael Bay, in Korean we would say the 동네북, which means like the neighborhood drum. Everyone gets the beat on him. Like because it's like a second a cut, right? It's this is kind of like the binary that's set up, right? The most commercial of the commercial, the most artistic of the art, right? It's just something to think about. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing, but I am pointing out that this is kind of the opposition, right? But I do like the way that Rosenbaum notes that it's the long takes and the questions that they imply, right? That like in watching an image for a prolonged period, like something begins to happen, and I do think that there's something there. On 15, he talks about let's see, the debate between film critics, and that again kind of goes to show of like film criticism and film analysis, right? That people can have markedly different readings and analyses, and again, and I think that the kind of best way to go about it is that there are no right or wrong answers or readings, which is really difficult for especially the kind of way that we're conditioned and trained in education, but that's kind of core to the liberal arts and the humanities and art and cinema, is that there are only strong and weak readings, and that's about it. Like, that things are, and the implication of that, if you think about it, the idea that there isn't something that's like, 100% kind of knowable and verifiable is actually kind of frightening if you think about it. But and I can get another one of these things that I can talk about further. But that's also where the humanities gets us to, is that it's actually liberating, that there's something liberating in the fact that, there are no right answers, like completely right or wrong answers, right? On 22, sorry about that. On 22, you see the discussion between Kiarostami and Tati, Jacques Tati. Tati is another filmmaker that I've shown. I'll probably show in intro, but I haven't in here. Show playtime. But I think Rosenbaum kind of fairly approaches this question of influence, right? And so you have like influence and homage, or even like copying, right? And he's pointing out that there are like formal patterns in Kiarostami that seem to be references to or like kind of influenced from Jacques Tati, the French director. And, Kiarostami basically saying like, no, right? This is something that I've kind of like thought about, used to quite a bit about, like, when you see these parallels or even what seems to be like direct allusions. And I think it's very much kind of wrapped up into that question of intentionality. I think it's the same thing. Like, did they intend to homage or copy? And to me, what I found is that this is not necessarily the most productive question. And sometimes, I think, and that's what this passage does, it's not even that directly answerable, where there might be evidence that, yes, the filmmaker did see that, or it's just as likely and possible that a filmmaker might kind of copy something and not know it's a copy, or they may have like watched the film and forgot about it, or they're unconsciously, or they picked it up from some other source. It's just not a productive question. Like, did they copy it? Yes or no? Because I don't think it's that simple. And what I mean by that is that, like, I'll give you, just an example. Like, what if we found in some film from 1987 someone wearing this exact ensemble, right? Did I knowingly copy that, right? No, because it's also like, well, this style, for example, is just, it's specific and it's particular, but it's also kind of diffused in the sense that it's like, we can find this style, all over the place, right? It's like, in hindsight, it's so much easier to kind of piece it together and say, this is that and this is this, but like when you're in the middle of it, it's like, it doesn't work that way. Does that make sense? I'm kind of rambling at this point, so I'm going to move on. But all I just want to say is that, did he or she copy something, X, Y, or Z? I just don't think that's the best way to go about a conversation about like connections and illusions, right? So on 26, Rosenbaum talks about how Taste of Cherry wins the Palme d'Or in 1997. And I know 1997 seems ancient to you, but to me that still feels relatively recent. Or like a kind of reminder that, like Iranian cinema is like still fairly new. And again, I bring that up to sort of like the legitimizing power of Europe and the US, right? Like getting a win at Cannes, what that does. On 26, and I think this is what's sort of crucial to both Kiarostami, but also just kind of non-commercial cinema in general, is how it elicits the participation of the viewer, of the reader. Like, you need to do the work. Film and the filmmaker is not going to directly do the work for you, right? 28 to 29, there is just a small block quote. In relation to this, at the very bottom to the next page, at a conference in Paris in 1995, he said, "I believe in a cinema which gives more possibilities and more time to its viewers, a half-fabricated cinema, an unfinished cinema that is completed by the creative spirit of the viewer, so that all of a sudden we have 100 films." I think that's like really beautiful. And Rosenbaum points out that like he means this literally, right? Like that if a viewer misreads the camera angle or type of lens used, that is still a legitimate reading to Kiarostami, which is kind of sounds to us sort of a really alien way of thinking about things. But again, to me, like, there's something really there. something that should be thought about in kind of that sort of empathy towards alterity, towards the other, that like, no, that person is not an idiot, they just have a very different way of seeing these things, right? I think that's a good note to end on for this, and then we'll go ahead and watch the film, and we'll take it from there. Okay.